Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And I'm very, very pleased today to have on the show Evan Thomas, the author of Road to Surrender, Three Men and the Countdown to the End of World War II, the kind of the gripping narrative history of the decision to drop the two atomic bombs on Hiroshima. And you'll know that this isn't the first time that we've kind of really engaged with the difficulties and the details of that historical moment. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Evan to the show. You'll find out a fascinating conversation about military and strategic decision making, the shortcomings and limitations of air power, and the almost sometimes impossible choices that are foisted on leaders during war. Okay, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And I'm very pleased to be joined by author Evan Thomas today, whose book Road to Surrender looks at the period of time before the dropping of the atomic bombs, and the careers of Carl Spaatz, Henry Stimson, and Togo, the Japanese foreign minister, and their part in the kind of the countdown to the dropping of the bombs. So firstly, Evan, welcome to the podcast. And I thought we could begin by talking a little bit about the kind of the process of writing and researching the books. Where did your interest in this period begin?
A couple of places. I've always wondered, as a lot of Americans wonder, did we really need to drop the bomb? And did we need to drop two of them? And mightn't there have been some way to do a demonstration? So I've always wondered about that. I also had a personal connection. My father was a junior officer on a landing ship tank, a landing ship that had been in Europe, actually at D-Day, and was headed to the Pacific for the invasion of Japan. So the myth in my family had always been, my sisters and I, that we were alive because of the atom bomb. I don't think that's actually true, as we can get into, but it's one of these myths that a lot of people carry. Mm-hmm. So I had these questions, and I was looking for a way to. Now, a lot of people have written about this. Mm-hmm. So the trick for somebody like me is to find a way to do that, and I like to do it through characters. Mm-hmm. So you can relate to them. So that mm-hmm. I care about the human dimension here, and I particularly care about, this is going to sound ponderous, but moral ambiguity. People who have to struggle with difficult questions. Wartime presents us all, lots of examples of wartime. And so I was looking for characters who were struggling with this, and I also wanted to tell the Japanese side, mm-hmm. because. Yeah. My wife and I had been to Japan for an earlier book about the Battle of Leyte Gulf and fascinated by the Japanese culture. So I ended up with three characters after a lot of trial and error. Mm-hmm. They are the American War Secretary, Henry Stimson, who's kind of the chairman of the board of the atom bomb. He ran the project. And it was really more involved in it than any president, FDR or Truman. Mm-hmm. I also wanted to have somebody on the line, so to speak, an operator, and that was General Tui Spaatz is his name, Carl Tui Spaatz. He had done all of the strategic bombing of Europe, so mm-hmm. he had a lot of experience killing civilians. Yes. I was obsessed with this whole business of killing civilians, a terrible and necessary thing in World War II, and he had done more of it than anybody. Mm-hmm. And he's the guy who was given the order to drop the atom bomb. He didn't want to do it. He tried to resist, but he did it. Mm. So those are my American characters. And on the Japanese side, the hero, and really the hero of the book, is this fellow Shigenori Togo. And he's the hero because he's the only one at the top of the Japanese government who wanted to surrender. The rest of them wanted to fight to the bitter end. Mm-hmm. And Togo, through persistence and wisdom, and actually finally bringing the emperor around, making the emperor realize, got to surrender here. He's the hero. Yeah. So those are my characters.
There was an essay written about well, probably longer ago now. I always say about 2 years ago, and it turns out to be about 10, by this incredible British historian called Geoffrey Wheatcroft. And if you ever get to read any of his books, they're really, really phenomenal. And he talked about this idea of the myth of the good war. He said, in popular imagination, World War One's sort of like the bad war because it was mud and trenches, but World War Two is like the wonderful war because you have the evil guys, and the good guys, and it's a war of movement. And he said, well, compared to World War One, World War Two is almost exclusively fought against civilians. I think if you look at the stats for civilians to soldiers who died, it's something like about 80% of all casualties of civilians. And he said, and also the good guys do an awful lot of civilian killing. You look at the British carpet bombing of Germany and American as well, and Carl Spaatz and in Britain, Sir Arthur Bomber Harris have a similar philosophy that you can grind down the enemy through civilian deaths.
Let me pick an argument here for a second here. I don't think Bomber Harris and Spaatz were exactly the same because Harris was pretty open about it.
Yeah,
he was pretty unapologetic about it. We're gonna bomb those cities. The Americans were much more ambivalent, and you could say hypocritical, dishonest about it. They talked about precision bombing, and which was a failure. They couldn't do it because for technical reasons, because the Germans were shooting back. And Spaatz is sort of caught in the middle. He's a different type than Harris was. It's too strong to say he was boastful about it, but he didn't make any bones about it.
No.
Spaatz was, he didn't like to admit that they were killing civilians.
Yeah.
It bothered him. Late at night, he would wake up and he wrote his wife full of doubts about what he was doing. And, he always referred to it as precision bombing. He did little things to try to, this is, I thought, very revealing. When it came time to bomb France, we've been bombing Germany. It came time to bomb France for the D-Day invasions. Spaatz put out orders, no more radar bombing, which was inaccurate, only visual bombing, because he was trying to save French civilians. He distinguished German civilians and French civilians, kind of for obvious reasons, but it shows you how it nagged at him. They probably did kill fewer French civilians than they would have killed otherwise, but they still killed a hell of a lot of French civilians because bombing was inaccurate.
I think by the time the battle for Normandy was over, there was something like about 25,000 French civilians who died, something in that order.
Yeah.
There was I guess by long before you dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American bombing of Japan had done kind of equivalent levels of damage to a huge number of Japanese cities anyway. I think it was McNamara was part of the kind of the industrial planning of destruction. So obviously, the dropping of the two bombs is a kind of a sort of an extraordinary standout moment in the history of warfare, but it's not as if there hadn't been a kind of like a long process of this anyway.
Yeah, this is a very difficult subject, and this is one reason why I wrote the book. Because you think this is the Big Bang at the end. We use these horrible weapons. Well, as I'm sure actually a lot of your listeners know, we killed more people in Tokyo on the night of March 10th with incendiaries, firebombing, than we killed in Hiroshima on August 6th. The numbers move around, but 100,000 roughly in Tokyo because we burned 16 square miles in March, and then about 70,000 quickly, many more later, but quickly with the flash of the atomic bomb over Hiroshima on August 6th. So we were already in the business of burning people alive long before we did it with an atom bomb. But again, it's a very murky record on why and who's deciding this. And without getting too far into the weeds here, and because a lot of your listeners probably already know this story, we tried to do precision bombing in Japan, with B-29s, 30,000 feet. And we discovered that there was something called the jet stream. Blew the bombers away. We missed. Our first general, Hansel, he got fired because he couldn't hit anything. And we brought LeMay. He tries too. Curtis LeMay, the famous Curtis LeMay. He tries precision bombing. It doesn't work. So he comes up with this idea of flying in at night, low, using incendiaries. Now, again, incendiaries weren't invented by Curtis LeMay. We had burned Dresden in February in Germany. Just a couple months before, the incendiaries were getting better. Technology was improving. We discovered something called napalm. And so this worked. The incendiaries worked on, because created a firestorm. And now, okay, were people shocked and horrified by that? No. The headlines say, oh, huge fires, populated area. But it's not like the American people rose up and said, how dare you? How can we be doing this? They wanted to get the war over with. They looked the other way. And my hero, Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, he's bothered by it. And he thinks it's a promise from his assistant, we're going to stop this. But the promise is not kept. No. The generals do it anyways, really because they had no other way. They wanted to show that an Air Force could wreck destruction and end the war, and only the firebombs work. So LeMay was given a license to burn 60 cities. But there's never a clear policy debate. The president of the United States doesn't go, let's firebomb Japan. That's not the way it works.
No. Presidents are presented with strategic pictures normally, and they are given the task of choosing between the bad and the worse option. I think that there's an awful lot discussed about the projections for what the numbers of US casualties, numbers of Japanese casualties, if there had been an all-out amphibious invasion. I think the figures projected are, I think, in perhaps the millions for US soldiers and the tens of millions for Japanese civilians. What do you make of that? Does your research suggest that those projections were valid, or that they had a job in influencing Truman's decision making?
This is another messy subject. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but they have a meeting on June 18th to discuss the invasion of Japan. And Truman, the president's worried it's going to be a bloodbath. Why? Because Iwo Jima was a bloodbath. That cost us 7,000, mostly Marines. Okinawa was being a bloodbath. That cost us about 12,000. And of course, they think it's going to be Iwo Jima and Okinawa on steroids, times X. But the military doesn't want to scare Truman too much, so they lowball the numbers. And the sainted General Marshall, our really wonderful Army Chief of Staff, basically signals MacArthur, hey, send in, cook the books here. Send lowball the numbers. And so the number presented to Truman is 31,000 American deaths, I think it is, not casualties, in the first month. That's a lowball number. Other numbers are more like 100,000, 200,000, 500,000. Who the hell knows? It's going to be but we do know that by August, we know that the Japanese have 1 million soldiers down there on the tip of Kyushu, our landing beaches. They have 7,000 kamikaze planes, all sorts of kamikaze swimmers and frogmen. I mean, it's going to be, they know it's going to be such a bloodbath, and this is not well understood by people. By August, just about the time of the atom bomb, the Navy and the Air Force are pulling out of the invasion plan. They're saying, we don't want to do it. The Navy Chief of Staff, Admiral King, he doesn't want to do an invasion. He wants to just do a blockade. Services like to do what they do best. The Navy wants to blockade. The Air Force wants to bomb. It's only the Army that wants to invade. General MacArthur, he wants to invade because that's going to be his invasion, biggest invasion in history. army, you got to have boots on the grounds. It's every service has its own, understandably, its own ideology. But by the time we dropped the atom bombs, two of the three services were against an invasion because it was going to be too bloody. Their plan was to burn and starve the Japanese to death with conventional bombing and a blockade. And my own guess is if we hadn't used those atom bombs, we would never have invaded. That's why I don't think my father would have died.
No.
And we would have starved the Japanese. So that by, say, Christmas, millions of deaths from famine.
Yeah. Well, the original, when you go back to the late 1930s, as the British begin to perceive that Japan is a strategic threat to the British Empire, the plan was to use Singapore as the naval base to send the Royal Navy to do basically the same thing. The British had learned that they essentially blockaded Germany into collapse from 1916 to 1918, and this is a very effective strategy. And the idea was always to starve out the Japanese home islands. So it makes sense that kind of American planners probably said, well, yeah, that would work. But let's talk a bit about the Japanese side now. So to those who probably very few people know about this character Togo, perhaps you could tell us a bit about him.
He's an unlikely hero. He's a dour figure. He's the foreign minister, and he's the only guy who's not in a uniform. Japan is run by something called the Supreme War Council, 6 people. The war minister, army chiefs of staff, navy minister, prime minister, all in uniform, all military. Togo's the one civilian. He is classically educated. He loved German philosophy. He hated Nazis, but he loved Goethe and Schiller. He's very dour. He's not a barrel of laughs. Even his own friends found him to be charmless. But he's the one guy who sees that there's a suicide that we're committing here, and we got to find a way to end the war. It's hard for him because the word surrender is forbidden in the Japanese government. You can't say that. That's dishonorable. And they mean it. The lower level colonels and majors, they threaten to assassinate people who talk that way. And that's not an idle threat. In Japan in the 1930s, 3 prime ministers are assassinated by young hotheads. And they're around. In fact, the climax of my story is there's a coup plot. I mean, even after they do persuade, after Togo persuades the emperor to surrender.
It's the middle-ranking guys that carry it out, isn't it? It's not generals that try to kind of quote unquote liberate the emperor. It's
colonels. It's the colonels. They're scared. The generals are scared of the colonels. One thing Togo does to sort of inch this process along, he gets the war council to meet secretly without their staff, colonels and majors, so that they can't be assassinated. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And the assassins are serious. They, as I say, the drama is that even after the emperor decides, these colonels stage a coup attempt. They murder the head of the imperial guard and his assistant. They chop his head off, and they forge orders that allow them to take control of the soldiers in the palace, running through the palace. What are they looking for? The emperor has recorded his surrender speech to be played to the nation at noon the next day. So the soldiers are running through the palace, trying to find that record, to break it, to smash it. They can't find it because it's hidden in a room reserved for ladies in waiting to the empress. I mean, it's like out of an opera. They can't find it. Finally, the colonel leading the whole thing, he goes out and shoots himself in the courtyard, and the coup ends. And you could say it was sort of a half-assed coup. It did end. But there they are, running through the palace. The emperor's hiding in his bedroom.
And in their view, Japan was heading towards one or other kinds of extinction. The kind of extinction where, foreigners set foot on Japanese soil and Japan loses its kind of its place as a sort of a kind of ethnically pure state that had existed since had been kind of in isolation for
ages eternal, I would say.
Yeah, or it's heading towards kind of going down in a blaze of glory, and it's the officer class that say, well, we'll go with blaze of glory. I think
it is crazy as we tell the story, and I sort of like the lurid operatic aspect of it. It's not crazy in this sense. What do they really want? What they really want, they know they've lost. Their fleet is sunk. Their cities are burned. They've lost. But what they want is no American occupation.
Yeah.
And no war crimes trials. And they want to keep their emperor. And they think, not unreasonably, that if they force us to invade, they can bleed us. There's a Japanese word for the strategy, shuketsu, I think it is. I probably mispronounced that, but they can bleed us until we give up and say, okay. We won't occupy you. And you can keep your emperor, no war crime. That's not nuts, because we might have sued for peace after we lost 100,000 soldiers, and we're still stuck in southern Kyushu. Totally plausible scenario. We might have said, okay, you can keep your damn emperor and have your country. What changes the equation? The atom bombs. Well, two things. One is the Russians invade Manchuria. And the Russians will invade Japan if they can. The only reason why the Russians don't invade Japan is that we have all the ships. The Russians don't have ships. But the big thing are the bombs.
Yeah.
And there's no answer to those bombs. And they don't know how many we have. Clearly, we have two. In fact, we had a third that was being readied for delivery. And this is, most people don't know this, but President Truman tells the British embassy on the 14th of August that he has, quote, sadly decided to drop a third bomb on Tokyo. Now, that's 4 hours before he learns the Japanese have surrendered. So Tokyo is spared. But that third bomb would have been ready about August 20th, about 5 days later.
Yeah. So, I mean, in some accounts, the idea is that the threat of Stalin is the game changer. But you say probably not so much, because they would have had the Soviets, they're not able to cross the sea to invade.
These are hypotheticals. There's a scholar named Hasegawa who wrote a book called Racing the Bomb, who argues that the decisive factor is Russia's entry in the war. I don't think the evidence supports that. He's a very serious scholar, and he certainly makes a good case. But my own reading, I'm more in line with some other scholars. I'm not a scholar. I'm a journalist. I live off of other scholars who are deeper into this stuff. But my take on this is the evidence suggests that the bombs were more important than the Russian invasion. And a big reason is the Russians didn't have ships. We had them.
And because at Yalta, one theory that's been presented was the conversation between Roosevelt and Stalin at Yalta, that Stalin would enter the war once Germany had been defeated, was on this kind of calculation that America didn't quite have the manpower in the East in order to finally defeat Japan. I mean, does that sort of make a sense, do you think?
Well, certainly our military wanted the Russians to declare war. This was part of it, as you say, at Yalta. They made an understanding, the Russians, who had a neutrality pact with Japan, that the pact would end, and the Russians, within 6 months of Germany's surrender, the Russians would come in on the side of the Allies, and because they were an ally, and attack or declare war, certainly, on Japan. So we wanted Russia in. Now, by midsummer, we were starting to change our mind. We didn't want Russia in. We wanted Russia out. Now, this is sort of early Cold War days. We're not trusting Stalin. He's gobbling up Poland and Eastern Europe. And so the equation is changing here. But we also realize, as a practical matter, we don't really need the Russians. We've got atom bombs, and we have an invasion force that is, if we have to invade, probably adequate to the task. So the equation changes. By August, it's a different picture.
Mm-hmm. And there is this sea change in national opinion, not just in Washington, but in across the USA, from a relatively, not necessarily friendly, but relatively cordial approach to the Soviet Union that had existed during the war, to in the last 6 months of the war, this really kind of fundamental change, probably from about the destruction of Warsaw onwards, as the American diplomats reported back that the Red Army had just sat there and let the Wehrmacht get on with it. At about that moment, so national attitudes were changing rapidly. When you look at the idea of, I mean, again, you get into some very, very complex territory about war crimes and the necessity of war crimes. You started looking at this, questioning whether the bomb was necessary, and from all of that, what have you concluded?
Yes, I think the bomb was necessary. I say that, this is the problem with the wars. You make these horrible moral choices, and because the bombs killed 200,000 people. These numbers move around; they're a little imprecise, but something like 200,000 people. That's an awful lot of people, and the vast majority were civilian.
Mm.
So there's nothing good about that. But the alternative was either an invasion of Japan, in which my father and a lot of other people would have died. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people would have died on the American side, plus all the Japanese we would have killed, or, and I think this is more likely, a blockade of Japan that would have cost in the millions of lives. Japanese were eating acorns by the summer of 1945. They had the worst rice crop in years, and we had figured out, our technology had finally improved so that we had figured out how to bomb rail lines. Our precision bombing now was actually starting to work. And we could probably disrupted the flow of rice to the Kanto plain, the plain around Tokyo, where about 70% of Japan lives on that plain. And we would have been able to starve them. We had something called Operation Starvation, which was mines that we placed around. That's a little bleak term, but that shows you where our heads were. We actually pulled back. There was some discussion of using chemicals to kill their crops. But we pulled back from that as being too bloody-minded, and also we thought it would make the population of Japan too resentful. These are the sort of moral calculuses that get made. They're ugly. Even the people making them don't like them.
No,
they don't. We didn't. Scholars talk about terror bombing. That's not what the Air Force talked about. They didn't use terror bombing. They said we're bombing economic targets.
Yeah. And it's part of a bigger picture of the kind of air warfare, and what Richard Overy calls the bombing war, that raises these kind of complex moral debates. And of course, you from the start of the Second World War through to 1945, you see this, as you say, this revolution in aviation technology and people trying new things throughout the conflict.
Well, they are. Initially, the hope at the beginning of the war is that they can end the war quickly with technology. The so-called bomber mafia in the United States, the pioneers of the Air Force, they thought that they could, that 19 bombs could put New York out of business. You bomb the power station, you bomb the bridge. Well, that's all great in theory. It didn't work. The British tried precision bombing at the very beginning. It didn't work.
No.
The reason why Bomber Harris chose to do area bombing was because the alternative didn't work. What finally did work pretty well was making a big fire X in the middle of a city with these Pathfinder, I think they were called Pathfinders, and then dropping bombs on the X at night. The British did it at night, and there was area bombing. It was this horrible word they used, dehousing the German population. Remember that? So is that word a cynical word? Is it a sarcastic word? Is it a bloodless word? You tell me. It's this creepy word though.
There's a great book by historian David Reynolds called The Long Shadow, and he talks about Roosevelt in that. And he says that the long shadow of the First World War was avoiding land wars that get bogged down. And one of the ways it was thought you could do that was through air power. And Roosevelt in, I think, 1936, I think it's 36 as the year the first B-17 was built.
Yeah.
He basically said, if we build 20,000 of these and give them to whoever Hitler is fighting, sell them, lend them, doesn't really matter. And Americans don't have to fight wars. We can just make these things, these amazing, powerful machines, and then you just bomb Hitler into submission, and then you don't have a war.
That was precisely the hope, and it looks good on paper. If you're bombing Kansas on a sunny day without any wind, the Norden bomb site works. But if you're over Germany and it's cloudy, and the Luftwaffe is shooting at you and there's flak in the air, it doesn't work.
No.
And so the British, being practical, said, we're not even going to try. We're going to bomb at night and, create these fiery X's or Pathfinders and all that. And there was a big debate over morale. Could we break German morale by killing civilians? The answer was no. We learned it didn't really work. There's a big debate about whether strategic bombing worked at all. In Germany. I think the evidence is mixed on that.
Very mixed indeed. Very mixed indeed. Well, there we must finish. Now, just a bit about the books. We always like to give these things a little bit of promotion. Is it currently available, or are we awaiting publication?
No, it's available. It's available in Britain and in the United States. You can go on. My pitch here is that this book moves right along. It's not a turgid book at all. It's as thorough as I can make it, and you can spend a lot of time in the footnotes. And so I think it's a scholarly book, but it is written to be read. And it is, I'm pretty sure your readers will find it is a fast moving and it's dramatic, a really kind of unbelievably dramatic book as it gets towards the end. One of my best blurbs from a guy named Philbrick, who wrote a book called Heart of the Sea, said, I dare you not to read this book in a single setting. It's really short. It's about 235 pages, which is about half my usual book length. Because I wrote it in the present tense. Make it urgent. So that's my pitch, is you won't be bored.
Fantastic. Well, I'll put a link in the show notes, and remember, folks, if you are going to get a copy, see if you can get it from an independent retailer. Those guys really need your help, and Amazon's got enough money already. Thank you so much, Evan. It's been a wonderful talk, and I do hope we can meet again to talk about military history and a variety of other things. I'll be delighted to chat again.
Nick, I hope so. This was fun.
Okay. Take good care.